talk a little bit about from the big picture to creating the culture of safety to what can we do physically with the school to the whole funding aspect. Would anybody like to talk a little bit about how do we take what is written down and it's in the plan and how do we enact that plan and make that happen? Would anybody care to start that, Paul?
Yeah, if I could just real quickly, we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. Just about every conceivable challenge that we have, somebody else has already addressed that in different states. So we're doing things to try to collaborate, network with other states. I know, like we collaborate with about between 20 and 25 of the states that have school safety centers, trying to identify what they're doing that makes sense that we could do. We have things like a resource toolkit on our website, and there's not anything conceivable related to school safety that we haven't have some subject matter links in there to address everything from bullying to radicalization to emergency planning to you name it. That resource toolkit where we draw from experts from all over Missouri, all over the United States. So things like that, making sure that people know where the resources are so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. They don't have to spend a lot of investment money redesigning something that's already been done. I think that's one aspect of looking at it.
Just from a law enforcement perspective, we got to make sure we continue to nurture the relationship between law enforcement and education and really nurture that relationship and build on it and continue to meet, consistently to heighten the awareness and the concerns of each entity. Mm-hmm. So as long as we continue to fight the problem together and we don't develop a confrontational attitude towards one another, I think we can be successful as far as improving the safety of the school.
So back to what we kind of talked about earlier on, it's the trust and communication, collaboration, that all parties working together.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's great. Sarah, were you going to say something?
And I would piggyback for Illinois with Paul is that, our Illinois Emergency Management Agency is very, very active in school safety issues. For instance, they have divisions in almost, it's our counties are grouped into divisions. There are people there that are on the ground, and so while we all acknowledge that there's not a one-size-fits-all, there are multitude of resources and plans that have already started to be drafting, or have already been drafted that you can mold and fit into your particular situation, whether you're rural, urban, and different things like that. So the absolute crucial thing is to have a plan and live your plan and breathe your plan, and it has to become second nature. You have to have those relationships with the law enforcement. If you change something inside your school, maybe it's a hallway, maybe it's something, and different things like that, but if you don't update the law enforcement agency, they're not going to know those type of things. I mean, we have to continue to share, and the students have to be familiar with our law enforcement, and our administrators have to be, familiar, and our teachers have to feel, that they can ask the questions and continue down that path. It cannot be something that, I think we're all guilty of getting something and putting it in a drawer. We've read it once, right, and that's it. We put it in a drawer. The school safety plan can't be something that it is drawer material. It has to be something that we understand. And it's just not active shooter. It's just not some of the
Sure.
big name items. I mean, we have to look at inclement weather. We have to look at what happens. We have a whole subset of schools that are on mining, subsidies. What happens with, different things like sinkholes and flooding. For all our schools, our Missouri and Illinois, friendly schools that are on the Mississippi, we have huge flooding issues. That's actually the #1 problem for us as far as health, weather related, is actually flooding. So we just don't think of those things, but we have to continue to have those conversations, and it's always better to be proactive than reactive.
Since every district is doing their own plan, is there any process in place to determine plan effectiveness, like an audit?
Yes. The U.S. Department of Education, through their readiness and emergency management for schools, technical assistance center, have an evaluation tool called EOP for Emergency Operations Plan Assess. And you can go into that tool and answer a series of a bunch of questions, and then it will give you a printout. It doesn't go to anybody else but you, but it will evaluate your emergency plan to tell you if it is a high-quality plan. And it focuses on things like, do you have the relationship already established with your local police department, your local fire department? Have they given input to that plan? Do you meet every year on that? Do you train your staff on the plan? Things like that are the questions that it asks. So there is a very good tool out there that the U.S. Department of Education already has available.
Good.
Also, I'll point out that this is very timely because this was just a couple of weeks ago at St. Louis County Superintendent's meeting. Ed Plus, which is an organization, as we all knew, was CSD before, but they've changed their name. They have put together a networking of all the crisis managers of each district in St. Louis County, and if you remember Ed Plus in that area, and they're going to start meeting. That hasn't happened yet, but their purpose is to compare plans. So we're sending our crisis manager from Lindbergh, and every district will do the same. Then they'll lay their plans side by side, and then they will look at similarities, differences, and share best practices. So that's a proactive step that's timely, because here we are, but they just put that in place, and they haven't even met for the first time yet. But that's an effort to not go solo, not just to make it, even with great resources on the federal and state level, still we can look at it as neighboring school districts and area school districts and say, what are we doing as a whole, and is there things that we can improve our plan by looking at somebody else's plan?
But I'm sure, most people, it's in the back of their mind and they plan on doing this anyway, but, Paul touched on a very critical component of any plan, as we always talk about the schools and law enforcement. We have to make sure that we bring in all the first responders, especially the fire department and EMS. Fire departments will be almost an invaluable resource to you on why you don't want to do something that, would impede their ability to provide life-saving services to the school in the event that they're the primary responder. Because we could, as you alleged to in the flooding or in a school collapse, the primary responder in charge of that incident is not going to be police in that incident. It's going to be fire, and police will provide support to the fire. So make sure that when we get involved in our plans, we take a holistic approach with all your emergency responders, whether they be police, fire, EMS, volunteer service organizations that could be responding to an emergency at a school.
I think in general, we can talk about general plans when it comes to school safety, and as she alluded to, everything's not going to fit everybody's profile or everyone's situation because of where you are and what the structure is of where you are. So I think we have to look at it from the aspect of being able to take what fits for your particular area and making that work. Another part of it that I think we have to look at is, we talked about law enforcement's approach in this. You can't paint that with a broad brush, and nowadays, in light of the way things have changed, that's something that really has to be examined, because as the Colonel alluded to earlier, this is a different breed of kid that we're dealing with. They engage us on a different level, and I'm just going to say it. If you're old school and can't adapt to that, you got to be able to change. You have to be able to change. You can't do things like you did them 10 years ago and expect to get results. You're not going to come in and you're not going to bully these kids or bully your way through the situations to get exactly what you want. And law enforcement has been notorious for doing that in the past, because that's what we knew. We didn't know anything any better. Nowadays, things have changed, so we have to approach it that way. And part of doing that is educating those in law enforcement as to how to approach it differently. And couple that along with the safety issues that we need to implement within the school systems, and getting the school administrators on board so that they understand it and that they welcome law enforcement, because they don't think law enforcement causes a problem or a hindrance in there. So
one thing we were talking about, go ahead, Jim.
Oh, go ahead.
One thing we were talking about out in the hallway too is that your plan just can't be like what happens in the crisis, right? What happens around the crisis? What happens after? What happens, before? Because one of the lessons that we learned from the administration standpoint in Sandy Hook was it was such an obviously national tragedy that no one was there as the funerals and as everything was happening after the fact. There was no one left to actually run the school and run the communications and run things. And everybody had that. Like the police had that, the fire had that, the community had that. Is that when we're looking at the planning, no, we don't want a 1,000-page crisis management plan, but we have to think, pre, in, post, of what does this really look like and how are we going to implement this as a whole.
That's a great point.
Another thing that from our task force that Ben and I were on, the issue of mental health, that is huge, and trying to provide, and you alluded to it earlier with students that you dealt with, the continuum of services. I think districts are struggling just to make sure they get consistent service for the mental health issues that they're dealing with students. And we had presenters, psychologists come and explain that just the inconsistencies in that system and trying to get students help and working through that system are a challenge for educators.
Okay, great.
A discussion earlier today about how we use social media, to identify these possible crises that take place in education. So if there's best practices as to how individuals have utilized that, I think that's something else to capture.
Great point. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I know from my standpoint, I'm very interested in sharing with other architects what the best practices are that we've developed, because they're developed with staff. It's developed with the administration. And hopefully they're not trying to go solo, as the phrase was, because I've seen too many times where people have gone solo, and there's just a wealth of experience that you got to have over the years to know how to get every detail right. So hopefully if we share these, then someone who is designing, let's say, an elementary school for the third or fourth time, having done 100, won't make some silly mistakes that any one of you can just walk in and see that, well, they really spent their money not very wisely. So
I was
we'll
really
put that on our
impressed
webpage.
with what Lindbergh did with that playground. And that was a very simple concept, but that's a model best practice, and I think it's those types of things that people see when they're looking at making adaptations in building system, how you utilize that for safety and security.
And I would love, from an administrator standpoint, if you could put those facility best practices, maybe not name them for security reasons,
Sure.
but once they come to you though and say, we'd like to go visit that entity, or we'd like to do that, because I just think from a parent standpoint, with having 3 kids under 8, you know what I mean, and from the different hats we wear as educational stakeholders, as attorneys and everything, if people have more access to what is best practice, then we can drive a more successful implementation as we go forward.
Well, what's interesting, when we take districts, new districts that we're just working with through some of our schools, if they just go on their own, they come away with, see, maybe 20% of what they should have seen. So we like them to actually see the administrator of the school, let the administrator take them through and say, here's what works really well, and here's, now that we've done it, we'd like to change it a little bit. So then that doesn't get repeated time and time again.
I just make one comment, one more on the task force.
Yeah.
Our task force was made up of 18 individuals that had school security safety experts. It had legislators, parents on there, administrators, teachers, and what came out of that, we broke into 4 subcommittees, and maybe kind of use it as an umbrella here. One of the committees was the physical plant, the facilities, and how you deal with that. The second one was training, and that covers, training the staff. And then the third was communication with parents, first responders. And then the fourth pillar was prevention. So that was kind of how we broke into our subgroups, and that's how we came up with our recommendations, which we had about 30 of them. But that helped kind of keep everything in order and make us more efficient.
That's great. Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Yes, sir.
I was very impressed today with the architectural aspects of improving the schools and making them safer, especially with those safe rooms and the safe playgrounds. Definitely focus on innovative ways to raise funding for those school districts that can't afford to equip their schools with those type of entities. So that's going to be very important, funding. You got great ideas, you got a great product, but the affordability is going to really hurt some schools that really deserve those type of entities to be placed in their schools.